The father of Elle Edwards, who was shot and killed on Christmas Eve in 2022, is calling on the government to introduce an early release appeals process, saying the current scheme makes a mockery of the justice system. 26-year-old Elle was murdered when she was caught in the crossfire of a gangland feud outside a pub on the Wirral. 2 years on, her father Tim has been told that the man who helped hide a gun after the murder is due to be released early. The Ministry of Justice wrote to Mr Edwards, saying Thomas Waring could be freed as soon as April 2026, 15 months earlier than planned. In a letter sent to Tim last week, the Prime Minister defended the early release scheme, calling it difficult but necessary. I sat down with Tim a little earlier and I started by asking him for his response to the government's decision.
This is obviously a move to crunch numbers, to level figures out, but they've lost sight of the human aspect in this decision. And this is a decision very much about the human consequences, because this is not, we're not making space for extra cars in a car park. This is about people's lives, victims of crime. And to be sort of disregarded how you feel going through that as a victim or a family member of a victim, that it's very impersonal, and it needs, for me personally, thinks it needs to be looked at as a case by case.
And it doesn't seem like that's an option. There was no suggestion of any course of appeal for victims or families in the letter you got from the Ministry of Justice. At the end of his letter, the Prime Minister said that it is of great importance to me that you and your family are able to receive the support you deserve during this time. As such, I have asked the Lord Chancellor to reach out and follow up with you. The Lord Chancellor is a senior government minister with responsibilities related to the justice system. Has the Lord Chancellor reached out, and are you any clear as to where you can take this next if you want to fight the early release?
Well, no, like I said, you don't have any input. Once the offender is sentenced, you don't have any input after that. And it gets to the point where you're just getting correspondence that's telling you their release dates. You have no input whatsoever in what happens when they're released. And as of yet, no, we haven't heard a thing from the Lord Chancellor or anyone from the Ministry of Justice, because the response they gave was to tell us that the home tagging system had been in place for the last 20 years, but that wasn't the question that we asked. The question I asked was, can you justify the decision that's being made in this case and in other cases? And I think it's important that they do take a look at it on a case-by-case scenario, because to try and just juggle the numbers around, people are going to slip through the net and re-offend. And I hope that it's not a case of someone's life is taken because of someone slipping through that net.
This letter from the Prime Minister was sent on the 21st of November, so a few days ago now. The Lord Chancellor, if they reach out to you, what would you want to say to them? Will you be asking for some form of system to allow families like yours to challenge these decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important that the families are given that respect to be able to question decisions that are made, such as this. Because even yesterday I got a message from a lady whose father was killed 20 years ago. Now, the killer of her father is due for release. And unfortunately, she's in a position, there's not a lot she can do about it. The sentence has been given, he's served his time, he's due for release. Now, she has no input or authority on what happens to that person upon release. So I think it's important that that's changed and families of victims are given a bit more input into what happens to offenders when they're released and where they're released to.
Tim, you'll have seen the news footage of prisoners released in the first wave this summer. Some of them popping champagne corks outside prison, being picked up by friends and relatives, cheering, celebrating, some coming to news cameras, openly thanking the Prime Minister for an early release, some openly admitting that they will go back to a life of crime. How does that make you feel to think that you could see Thomas Waring doing that?
Sick, because he's the one other person who knows where that gun is. So what's to stop him coming out of prison early, going straight to where that gun is, and either passing that gun on to be used again or using it himself? There's nothing to stop that happening, and it makes me sick to think that he's been rewarded in my eyes for his crimes by being released early, and it pains me to think that that's the case, and not just our case, in other cases that's happening regular. Like you say, people are celebrating getting out of prison early. It just tells you what they think of the system. It's there to be used, and they're going to use it.
Tim, as a result of your daughter's murder, you have been thrust into this world of advocating for those who want to end violence against women and girls. You set up a foundation in Ellie's name, and I know that today is the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women, and you're actually leaving us to go and take part in an event to support that. Have you been surprised by the level of violence against women and girls?
Well, obviously with Ellie's case, you know, and the murder investigation and the circumstances around Ellie's death brought it to the forefront of my mind and my attention. But as we've gone along in the last 2 years, to see the numbers of offences against women, and in particular serious violence, it's shocking. It's shocking. I don't know if it's more than it used to be, or is it just now more in the public eye? Are we more aware of it now? But I will say that it's certainly not on the decrease, and you know, and that goes the more inclusion of women in organised crime groups being used, and you know, the women using it, being involved in violence themselves. And I get that because of the environment they're in. That becomes the norm. I think it needs to be looked at in a broad spectrum. That it's not just necessarily men that are involved in the running of crime and organised crime, different things.
Well, Tim, perhaps we could just end by talking about Ellie, which is what has got us to this point and what has got you to become an advocate for women and girls in ending violence against them. What's life like without her? Because after her murder 2 years ago, the public found out a lot about her, and you spoke so glowingly of her, and you carry her with you every day.
Yeah.
What's life like without her 2 years on?
There's a void. You know, there's always going to be that void of not having Ellie around, and you know, as a father, as her dad, and you know, she's my best friend, and when that's taken from you, it's hard to adjust. But Ellie has given me the power to use her voice that she's no longer able to use. So, as long as I can use her voice and make sure her name is used every single day in some kind of positive way, then that's the least I can do, and that's the nearest I'm going to have to her being by my side every day.
Well, thank you to Tim Edwards for speaking to us, and he told me after the interview that in the name of Ellie, he is not going to let this go. Well, in response to our interview there with Mr Edwards, the Ministry of Justice sent us this statement which says this was a horrific crime and our thoughts remain with the family and friends of Elle Edwards. It goes on to say the new government inherited a prison system on the point of collapse. It has been forced to introduce an emergency release programme to stop a crisis that would have overwhelmed the criminal justice system.